You're listening to the Valley Current.
Generally speaking, the tortfeasor, the defendant, has to accept all the consequences of their original tort. So if you say the original tort here was, this is what some people think, that Chinese were screwing around in a lab with something that could be a bio weapon, and it escaped the lab and made its way to the wet market through recklessness, negligence, intentional misconduct, whatever level of culpability you want to assign to it. It was so risky that in U.S. law, we call it strict liability. It's an inherently dangerous thing to play around with bioweapons and not take the consequences. It's like playing around with dynamite. We know it explodes. You have to take super precautions, or there's what's called in the law strict liability. Well, if there was such a thing as worldwide strict liability based on some sort of court in the United Nations or The Hague or somewhere else, then China would have to belly up for what my guess is going to, by the round number, whenever we get to it, it's probably going to be north of $100 trillion. That's just my sort of round number estimate. Maybe someone's going to say that's low. The GDP of a lot of countries took quite a hit, including the U.S., as a result of the last 2 years. Now, we also learned a lot of things along the way, but is China worried about that? I don't know that they necessarily are, but certainly in the court of public opinion, they can't feel great about the origination of this thing, right? Or am I ranting at this point?
Ironclad, and it's just missing. In fact, I think I heard recently that there's some suggestion that the COVID-19 virus appeared in Belgium before it appeared in China. I may have that wrong.
Really?
Yes. But again, there's no hard evidence for any of this. And evidence would be very difficult to get. So, and even if you could prove that it came from a single person in China or anywhere else, that doesn't seem to me to make that person guilty of doing something wrong or evil. It's an accident of nature. It could be considered, and probably is, something that was not intended to happen to that first victim. It's hard to believe that that would be the case. That first victim didn't invent the virus. It mutated in that person's throat over which he or she had no control. It's like Typhoid Mary. Was she ever sued and paid a price for spreading typhoid fever to the dozens of people who she infected? I don't think so.
Well, it's the question is, usually when there is a disease, it's not something that's being cooked up in a lab, right? Like, that's the starting point. Is it being cooked up in a lab? Like playing with dynamite in a lab, if that dynamite blows up and a fire is caused that wipes out a town.
Well, I know one example of a outbreak. Well, it wasn't really an outbreak, I don't think. It was during the period after the Second World War, when there was an effort to eliminate smallpox from the planet.
Right.
And the people who were concerned came very close to doing this, although I think it still smolders in Pakistan and some remote areas. But it was reduced to 99% of what it certainly was a few hundred years ago. But that there would be 3 places that the virus would be stored, so that the hot virus, so that in the future it might be needed for studies or research or a lot of other possibilities for its later use. And one of the storage places was in England. And I don't recall now all the details, But it was so smallpox vaccine existed in vials in 3 labs, London, Moscow, and Fort Detrick, Maryland.
Right.
And there was and in London, I don't know how it happened, as I said, but it escaped from the laboratory in which it was being worked upon, and was circulated through the ventilation system to some laboratories in the floor below. But I think the infections were caught in time. I don't believe there are any deaths, and I don't remember now whether there is actually pathology. But you could look that up and find out. Yeah. But that's one of the few cases that I know about. Also, it was motivated, these places, to hold the virus. There have been efforts, most of which have failed, although there have been a few examples where it has been recovered. The virus that caused the 1918 pandemic was found in the cadavers of some of the people who died, I think, from the outbreak. And that was very difficult to come by, but very important to know whether it had any relationship to current viruses. Mm-hmm. So that's the reason why it was decided to store it in those three labs. There was some fear that the Russians would use it to make agents use and weaponize them for biological warfare. I don't know whether I ever told you this, but I was involved in the effort of this country to determine whether biological warfare agents were being used in the USSR when the CIA contacted me in I don't remember the exact year, it was the late 60s, I think.
Right.
Or maybe the late 60s or early 70s. Have I ever told you this story?
No.
When I was invited by the Russians to teach them how to produce vaccines in my cell strain WI-38, the World Health Organization funded my trip to Moscow, where I stayed for several months to teach them at their Institute of Virology how to make vaccines in WI-38. I was there for, I think, about 6 weeks. During that time, I brought my wife over. We had some very interesting experiences. I won't go into those now. But before, and also at that time, I was corresponding with Zoris Medvedev, who was, of course, a known personality to the Soviet Union and to the government because he was a refusenik. He was in contact with a very close friend of mine, another scientist in this country, before I knew him. Zoris was invited to give a lecture in Leeds, England. Mm-hmm. But the Russians would not let him out. And so it was arranged that our mutual friend, Bernie Strahler from USC, was authorized by Zoris to present the lecture in Leeds on his behalf, which he did indeed do. That's how the contact was made. And Bernie, when he found out that I was going to Moscow and also that I was going there not under the agency of Intourist, which you may remember was the only way you could visit the Soviet Union was through Intourist.
Right.
I was first of all not there on a tourist visa. I was there as a guest of the Ministry of Health of the Soviet Union. So I was there in a completely different category. Before I left, I was contacted by a man. He's from a very famous Philadelphia family. And he contacted me and said, Hayflick, you are a microbiologist, you know Zoris Medvedev, and you're going to Russia as a guest to the Ministry of Health. There are things that we would like to know about. And he ended the conversation there. It was very clever. There's nothing written. There is no paper. There's no letters. Nothing. But I knew that this fellow had contacted me in Philly from the CIA. So upon my return, but I had an inkling. At that time, it was very a popular subject of biological warfare. So I had an inkling that was probably the only reason that they would be interested in my trip. I'm a microbiologist. I'm going to be going to their major facilities. And so it wasn't, although they never said anything to me, I had an inkling that's what it was. So anyhow, so I was there for about 6 weeks. I made many observations about the building construction, electric wiring, and several of these buildings are very primitive. They're built in the late 1800s. They had exterior wiring covered with thick insulation and then painted white. What do they call it? Whitewashed. The buildings were whitewashed. So when I came back, this fellow got in touch with me, and then he asked me questions verbally, and would I write down my answers, which I did indeed do. The other thing that I did, when I was in the Soviet Union at that time, the scientists I was in touch with were very kind people, very nice people, of course. And they took me to the Bolshoi ballet and lots of things. I won't go into all the details now.
Right.
And the CIA is that they asked me what I would like to see and do. I said, well, I'm going to be here over May 1st, a May Day parade.
Right.
Could you get me tickets to the May Day parade? They said, oh my. They said, that's difficult. We really don't think that's going to be possible. Okay. So the night before the May Day parade, I was in a hotel in the center of Moscow called the Budapest Hotel. And I get a knock on my door. I open the door and there's a guy there I never saw before with a sheaf of papers, hands them to me and says, and leaves. And I look at the papers. Of course, they're all in Cyrillic. I don't speak or read Cyrillic. But it was obvious from pictures and diagrams that these looked like tickets to the parade. Mm-hmm. To the May Day parade that you've seen pictures of on TV, I'm sure. So sure enough, that morning I got up, I walked outside and there's barriers on the street. I go to the barrier and a soldier looks at me quizzically. I hand him the sheaf of papers. I didn't know, what do you want to look at?
Right.
Pulls one of them off and lets me through. It turns out that the center of Moscow has circumferential circles of decreasing diameter so that the center of the last one is red square.
Right. Right.
Each barrier that I go through 3 or 4, getting closer and closer to red square. And I get to red square and someone shows me where my seat is, and my seat is right under the Politburo, right under Lenin's tomb, with the Politburo with I don't know who, was it Khrushchev? I forget who was in power then. And sitting next to me is a little girl about 6 or 7 years old, and next to her is her father, Yuri Gagarin.
Right.
The first astronaut.
Right.
I introduced myself to Gagarin. We couldn't speak to each other. He didn't know English. I didn't know Russian that much. So I played with the little girl who's sitting next to me. And I'm also taking pictures of the rockets coming by on the rocket carriers. I mean, you've seen all this on TV. Right. It's not a secret. And tanks and all kinds of stuff. And I was taking pictures of all of this. Other people were too. The only people in Red Square at that time were generals and famous people in Russia. I didn't know any of them, of course. And high-ranking politicians and, military. So when I came home, he said, okay, well, let me have them. And he took them. And several weeks went by, and he came back. He said, "Hey, Flick, let me tell you something. These pictures are of no use to us."
Mm-hmm.
Says, because we know from past experience and looking at similar pictures that we see on TV, that the so-called huge rockets that are on these carriers cannot be what they portray them to be, because the weight isn't there. They have to weigh a certain number of tons in order to depress the tires.
Right.
When we look at these tires, and we have specialists who know about rubber compression and all that, on details like that, these tires are not compressed enough to indicate an extremely heavy weight on the carriers. So they're probably mock-ups,
right,
for public consumption. And so that was pretty much a surprise that they had that kind of detail. And then I gave my report to this agent, and a couple of weeks later he said, "Hey, Flick, they would very much like for you to come to CIA headquarters." And
yeah, I know. It's a place in Virginia, right? Yeah, the CIA has control of that city. Right?
So, of course, I said, "Sure, if they want to interview me, I'll be happy to do that." So I took the train to Washington. They said a plainclothes guy will meet me at Union Station in a plain car, and he'll drive me to Langley, Virginia.
Langley, right.
And so that's what happened. I arrive at Langley and walk into the headquarters, and they treat me like a package. In other words, when I first arrived, they put a tag on me,
right,
with paperwork, and I'm now owned by that person who checked me in.
Right, right.
And as I go through the building, I get checked in, and people accept me as their package, and that's how I make my way up to the conference room. And what they're interested in is whether I know anything about policy. That's what they were not interested. They had already seen what I had written on the answers to questions, namely right, that the electrical capacity of the building was incapable of firing up a fermenter.
Right.
You need fermenters to make large quantities of bacteria and viruses. So that they already know, but they want to know about policy. Well, I didn't know very much about policy.
Right.
And so I don't remember the details of our conversation. There were about 6 or 8 people around the conference table. They're interested in biological warfare and what
right,
policy is. Well, I didn't have access to that. Anyhow, that was an experience that I had with through Zori's, I think. And I don't recall now why I went off on this tangent, but there were many other interesting stories that I experienced in Moscow and in a couple of years later in Kiev, all involving the Russian intelligence.
I mean, people listening to this podcast should know that it actually is quite a privilege to get a visa to Russia. I was able to get a visa to teach in Moscow, and there is quite a process to doing it. And you and I are probably just a relative handful of Americans that have made our way to Moscow and have gotten.
I didn't have to go through any paperwork.
Oh, you did?
WHO arranged the trip, and I don't know what they did.
Yeah, I'm sure they had to do a bunch of paperwork for you. This is not. This is quite a bureaucracy.
Yeah, the Russians wanted me, and so it was up to them to make it easier for me to get there.
Right. Yeah. So they probably expedited your paperwork. With mine, they took a little more time, even though the law school I was teaching at was saying, "Hey, this class has to start on a certain date." Blah blah blah. And so the point that I'm making is that, the press presents Moscow and its people in a way that, in my opinion, is far different than the actual Moscow that I experienced and the people that I experienced in Moscow.
Yeah.
And that's an example of this point that the press doesn't necessarily have its finger on the pulse of what actually is going on, even though we obviously read the press and we're grateful for, I still get the physical newspaper delivered. It drives everyone in my household crazy because I have a stack of newspapers and they think it's like a fire hazard. But in general, I still like, seeing the ads that play out in these newspapers. But you have to wonder how much of it is accurate and how much of it is leaving out a lot more of the story. And you've identified kind of a big question that really should be on Fauci's mind. And I got to believe if you did have a private call with him, he probably would tell you a thing or two about how they're thinking about this variant or this mutation, right?
Oh, sure. I mean, like lawyer, you are expert in various areas of law.
Right.
And when you talk to colleagues with similar expertise.
Right.
I talk to colleagues with expertise similar to mine.
Right.
You get a different picture.
Right. So to me, you've raised a really good question. I guess I will be looking to see whether anyone picks up on this. Of course, when we publish the podcast, we'll get you a link, and you could send it to Tony Fauci, and he can listen to this in all of his free time.
Well, I hope by then they do what I'm complaining about.
Right. I mean, it seems inevitable that someone's going to pick this up and start interviewing people just to find out some basic facts, right?
Sure.
I mean, some really basic facts might well include things like, what does your health level have to be to get this? Because maybe it's only people that are more vulnerable, right? We don't know.
What seems to be true is that this Omicron mutant is not killing people.
Right. So you have to wonder whether there's a bigger story here too. Like, what if the mutation is itself mutating quite rapidly? So there's actually not just this particular label that they put on it. I know there's like a coding system, right? There's a certain coding system here.
Yeah, well, the RNA sequences is the genetic code of the virus. Mm-hmm. That's what you mean.
Right.
It's a long string of chemicals, 4 chemicals, that you can think of it as a long string of beads with 4 colors. Each bead has one of the 4 colors, and if you do the math, you'll understand how the combinations of colors and what portions of the sequence of beads is a gene. You will get some idea of how many genes probably this virus has, and it's going to be a very small number because the genes are coding only for the spike proteins. I don't know how many proteins are on a spike, but that's certainly known. And it's coding for the capsid, that is the envelope that the spikes sit on, and other sequences are coding for the actual genetic material, that is the code itself. Mm-hmm. So it's not a really complicated, viruses are not really complicated in that respect. So knowing the sequence of the first COVID-19 virus, you know the string of beads, you know the colors of each one of them, and then you get a mutation where you discover that somewhere on that string of beads of the COVID-19 are changes that are characteristic of the Delta mutant. And now you find changes that are typical for the Omicron mutant. So it's not terribly complicated.
Look at the possibility that maybe there actually is a fast-moving set of mutations And that's the part that they don't have their arms around. Like, is that theoretically possible? That it's not just this one labeled item, that it's actually 10, 20, 30 different mutations?
I don't know whether it is known whether there is a specific region of this long string of beads where the mutations are occurring, or whether it's random over the entire length. I doubt that it's random over the entire length, because what seems to be mutating is the coded portion of the genome that's coding for spike protein. There doesn't seem to be any coding differences on the capsid, that is the envelope. So it's possible that mutations for the capsid, the envelope, are lethal, and so they don't appear. Whereas mutants that involve the spike proteins are not lethal to the virus, and so that's where all the mutations are occurring. That's possible, but I don't know that for a fact.
So we'll keep watching this. I will be looking more and more for whether or not we see some scientists go on and say, let's do some. I mean, really, it could even be an investigative reporter in many ways. This is a pretty important subject.
Exactly. Right. If you do find that, please let me know.
Of course. Thanks for spending your afternoon.
Okay, regards to Lee and to you.
Yeah.
And, her mother, I guess.
Yeah, we're all good. We're all good. It's been an interesting holiday without my mom, the first Thanksgiving in a long time, because I would typically come out to Florida for Thanksgiving to be with my mom, and particularly after my dad died.
First Christmas.
Yeah, it would be the first Christmas too, but just the nature of life and the way it does come to an end eventually, you just have to accept that.
That's right. Someday somebody will be saying the same thing about you and me.
Yes, sir. We just have to live every day. We have to live every day appropriately as a result. Right?
That's right. That's right. I want you to someday go to the restaurant in Orlando called Burns Steakhouse.
Right. Yeah, we plan to do that. Right.
Hopefully they're still in business. It is one of the best restaurants in the world.
We'll do that. Hey, listen, Len, mark your calendar for March 10. I sent an email on this. There's going to be the annual final lecture at Stanford. That's 5 days before Wally's 92nd birthday, I think, this next year, 2022. That's Wally's 92nd. And that's the final of the winter seminar on lifestyle medicine. So they start that course. I think they've started it, or they will start it shortly, and it runs until March. It's this lifestyle program. I'll send you the syllabus, and they want to have a panel discussion, particularly with me moderating between you and Wally, what steps you've each taken to maintain your autonomy and your health span through your lengthy lifespan, because you're both in your 90s, and
what
you're both
is in March.
Yeah, March 10 at I think 11 or 11:15 a.m. I'll send you the details by email. But it would be great if you could come to Portola Valley. You could stay with me. I'm sure you could stay with Wally as well. And you could.
I have a daughter I stay with.
Yeah, of course, you could do whatever, but we can march down to. We can head down to Stanford for this group of medical students who are taking lifestyle medicine. That's their new course. That sort of, hey, most of medicine isn't really about medicine; it's about lifestyle and helping patients, really clients. If you want to think about the future of being a doctor, it's more like you have clients than patients. You're not treating illness, you're treating lifestyle. So it's a whole new way, as you know, of thinking about doctors helping their patients, now clients, to live their full health span, which hopefully will match their lifespan and not what typically happens. And you and Wally are a couple of examples that could speak to a lot of issues. And I'll put together a list of questions for you and Wally to think about.
Okay, well, I'll look forward to that.
And then we'll head over to a steakhouse like MacArthur Park or one of those other ones in town and have an evening out.
Good.
All right. Good talking to you.
Well, it's good talking to you.
All right. See you later. Bye-bye. Take care.
Stay well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.